Yo friends, these are some ramps, also known as wild garlic or wild leek, wild onion. They're a really special treat for springtime foragers because they only grow about 2 weeks out of the year and they're pretty hard to grow commercially. I've heard that professional chefs say they're their favorite type of allium to cook with. Alliums are those plants that have that garlicky or oniony smell to them. And that's what makes this plant pretty easy to identify. It kind of just looks like two, maybe even one leaf sticking out of the ground with a bit of a red base here. But if you break off a piece or even rub your fingers against it, you'll get that classic oniony or garlicky smell. And pretty much anything that gives off that classic onion smell is safe to eat. You want to double check and you want to identify it, but that smell is a pretty good indicator that it's safe. Now, when you're working with ramps, it's really important to harvest sustainably. The best thing you can do is find a plant that has 2 leaves like this and pluck just one of the 2 leaves, letting the rest of the plant live and produce more leaves next year. You'll see these plants in large colonies with hundreds or thousands of plants sticking out of the ground. But unfortunately, it's pretty easy to decimate these whole colonies pretty quickly in just an hour's worth of work. If you go in and dig up a whole bunch of plants, you can really decimate this colony because it takes about 7 years for a seed to be planted in the ground before that plant starts producing its own seeds. They're a really slow to reproduce species. So foragers get pretty mad when other people go in year after year digging up whole clumps and whole sections of ramps. And you know what? The leaves taste just as good as the bulb, so there's no need to get the whole plant. You can very easily work with just the leaves. Now, I'm telling you not to dig up the whole plant, but the plants I'm showing you are actually plants that I dug up from a large colony and I transplanted here to my property. I went in and dug up just a handful of plants one time, left most of the colony alone, like 99% of the colony alone, and transplanted those plants here on my property, and then went back later in the year to collect seed from that colony and intentionally sow it, which greatly increases its chances of sprouting. Here's another section of ramps on my property that are just starting to come up. These are ones I also transplanted. And what I did for transplanting these is I went in with a hori-hori or a small shovel and I dug up a clump of ramps and I rinsed off the roots so I had just clean ramps with their bulbs. And then I set those plants in a bucket of water, just a few inches of water, so the water was covering just the bottom of the plants, just the bulbs. I drove home with them in that water, and then I transplanted them into a spot on my property that gets some shade. They really like to grow in the woods and also has soil rich in organic matter. I found that first year they don't really do much. They kind of hang on. They don't like being transplanted, but I've had pretty much 100% success rate. They'll come back the next year strong and vigorous. Here's another little clump. When you go out into the woods, you'll notice they really like to grow close together like this. They like growing in clumps scattered about the woods. My strategy was to dig up mostly young plants that weren't producing seed that colony needed to continue to grow, but I dug up 1 or 2 older plants that produce seed in the hopes then to produce seed on my own property and continue to grow on my own property without having to go and dig up plants continually from that colony. Ideally, here in a decade or two, this whole area will be scattered with ramps, fresh for the picking this time of year. I haven't lived in an area long enough to really grow experience with growing ramps from seed, but I've read that they can have a pretty high success rate in germination if you scatter them on the ground and lightly cover them with a layer of mulch. Unfortunately, oftentimes it takes about 2 years for the seeds to germinate, so you won't recognize your success right away. My strategy right now is to collect as much seed as I can, to sow it as much as I can, and wait 2 years and find out what happens. There's a whole bunch of recipes online, a lot of stuff people like doing with ramps. Frankly, my favorite thing to do is to pluck the leaves in a sustainable manner and then just saute them with a little bit of oil and eat them like that. So good. Not really a food that will ever really fully sustain you, not really a substance crop, but a really, really delicious little treat. Harvest responsibly, forage safely by identifying before you put it in your mouth, and happy growing, friends.